welcome. So as for improving my fitness in 2025, I wanted to do something a bit more functional for shoulders, and what greater thing is there to do for that than swinging a sledgehammer. However, I did want a bigger sledgehammer than the one that I've already got, so I thought I could do a sledgehammer renovation video as part of the whole deal, of which I managed to find a cheap £14 sledgehammer head on eBay, which I could clean up, and then I just need to make a fancy looking decent handle for it. Point to note before going on, as I'm sure there'll be some blue collar people watching this thinking what you're doing, this sledgehammer isn't for work, it's literally just for gym work, mainly for hitting tyres or doing some of those mace manoeuvres that people like to do, not for hitting anything like rock or steel that'll cause a lot of vibrations into your hands. With that being said, we'll move on to the hammerhead and then onto the grip.
And here is that hammerhead in question, a £14 old hammerhead, rusted up. Now, I was actually trying to find a £20 hammerhead, but seemed pretty rare, so I had to go for this one. However, as you can see, it's still a fair bit bigger than a regular sledgehammer. Firstly, I just want to take off that first layer of rust and see how badly corroded this head actually is. I'd like to be able to clean this up and really polish it up well. However, if any of the corrosion and divots are too deep, I will just have to leave them, as I do actually want this hammerhead to remain somewhere near £14 and not have to grind it back to 10. At this point, I did find that it was skating around the bench a little bit, so I decided to get the handle and start fitting the handle to it so I could come back to the grinding later. Of which, because I want to make a custom grip that goes over this handle, I just went for some 30 by 30mm box section. Again, this hammer isn't going to be used for work, so it doesn't matter if this is slotted up the middle and then welded in. As you can see, I did have to cut some slits in the box section just to allow it to actually go into the gap properly. Could have probably used 25mm box section, to be honest, but once I'd cut those slits, it did slot in just nice. I did also very lightly weld this on, just in case I want to get it off in the future, but with that done, I was able to handle it a lot better, as you can see, and fully grind it up and see what it's actually going to look like. It did start to shine up pretty well, but I could already tell I wasn't going to be able to get all of the corrosion and all of the divots out with the grinder, and I'll have to accept some blemishes, but it should still look shiny and good for a video. This also gave me the first opportunity to properly hold it, at which point I thought, yes, this is definitely going to be heavy enough, especially when you consider I'm going to want to do reps of this and sets. This also meant it was a time to do the custom grip, so we'll go over to Fusion 360 and see what I managed to come up with. So this is what I went for. It is simple in shape to allow your hands to slide up and down it pretty easily. However, I do have these little creases on the edges to act as grip, which I do also think look pretty good. There is also a ridge line down the centre, and then to try and make it as interesting as possible, I've put some writing down the middle. Now, if you ever need any interesting quotes, I find the best place to start is usually the Roman Empire, especially as you can do it in Latin and make it sound all fancy. So on this side, we have a quote that is vis brevis opus atrium, probably is how you pronounce that, which translates to a short force, an eternal work, which frankly feels like what YouTube is, so I guess it fits quite well for that. And then on the other side, we have a much simpler in ferro veritas, which means truth in steel, which I thought fit pretty well for a hammer. It is worth noting that I think a lot of the Latin language is a bit simpler, especially in the Roman time, so iron and steel I think is referred to as the same thing, and steel can also refer to sword. However, I'm not a linguistics expert on that. It's just I've noticed there seems to be quite a lot of overlap. And that nicely times us for the screen recording down to the bottom of the hammer, where I've put kind of a bit of a pummel at the bottom, mainly to help you grip it, as it's probably going to be quite smooth. So that should help to keep it in your hand. Now, what am I actually going to make this grip out of? Well, I've kind of got three options. The first one, which I was hoping to do, was to actually make it out of TPU, so just 3D print TPU rubber. However, when I had a go with that, it was an absolute pain and just kept blocking up the nozzle. I'd like to keep going with it, but unfortunately I had some other stuff I needed to print, so I abandoned that one and made some molds for the second attempt, as I have some gel coat resin that I don't mind losing if I do it wrong. So I'm going to 3D print some molds that fit around the 30mm box section, and then fill that with the gel coat resin and see if I can get a decent mold out of this. Failing that, I'll just 3D print the entire grip and stick with that. It might be a little bit firm, but it should actually slide through your hands pretty well, which for this purpose might actually be a plus. We'll start off with what turned out to be the attempt at the gel coat resin, which on the plus side, the molds had come out pretty damn well. I was actually really pleased with how these came out. And this is something good for me to learn from. I haven't done any 3D printed molds before, only kind of manual molds. So it was good to see how these came out and what detail you could get off them. For the release agent, I went with wax as normal. However, I did realise a good method of getting into all the gaps with this, and that is a toothbrush. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of wax down all of the grooves, especially with the letters, which are in quite like an old style font, making it a bit worse for that. And I did find using the toothbrush worked very well indeed. Once I got a nice layer applied to all of the pieces, I then very carefully marked them all up so they'd be in the correct order and got them wrapped around the 30mm box section, or at least the first pieces. With the resin mixed into one of the many monster cans laying around, I then started to pour it into the mould and realised immediately this wasn't going to work very well, as the resin was just too thick to actually get it to pour nicely down it. I did try to open up the mould a little bit to make sure I got a lot down and then try to compact it in, but either way it didn't work particularly well. The other thing that I realised was this was going to get way too hot too quickly with the gel coat resin going off, and it did start to kind of bend and weaken the moulds. And when I decided to pull that first section off to see what it actually looked like the next day, you can see how the gel coat didn't go all the way to the bottom. Although it is worth noting that it did actually get pretty good detail in the moulds. So at least I know from that point of view, the 3D prints were actually pretty good moulds. It was just the gel coat was too thick and it got too hot. So I'll get this gel coat broken off of the bar and then start 3D printing the full grip out of PLA. On the plus side, the gel coat did break off pretty easily, so it wasn't a big cleanup job. Although the hammer did bounce off the bench and nearly land on my foot, which I'm pretty sure would have ruined my day. While perhaps there'd be more fitting in TPU, they did of course come out pretty well in PLA, printing them off in 4 sections, of which I'll use some rubber resin and get them all bonded together and bonded to the steel bar. While the letters, in my opinion at least, came out pretty damn well, I want to paint them in white just so they show up better, particularly for the camera. So to start with, I tried to just fill them in by hand with a brush, using some old white Warhammer paint, as the Warhammer paint would allow me to just go over the top with some wet paper towels and take off any mistakes. However, what I did find with this is the Warhammer paint did seem to absorb into the PLA a bit too much. I didn't have any Tipex to use, so I decided to use spray paint, of which I masked off the sides to make sure that I couldn't get any paint on them, and then use some of that release wax to go over the top around the edges of the writing, just to make sure that it'd be easy to get the paint off of there, while the paint would stick fully into the letters themselves. This meant I could get most of that paint off simply with the green side of a sponge, and then the rest of it I did have to get off with sandpaper. This did dull the top of the finish a little bit then, but that was an easy fix, as I just got some black paint on some kitchen towel and massaged it into the plastic, making sure that I didn't get any in the letters themselves. This, as you'll see, in my opinion at least, came out pretty damn well. I did then just lacquer over the top of this to try and help keep these paint layers in, which led to the completion of the grip. To finish off, I did also do a final grind on the head to get it as clean as possible without going absolutely mad. And I did also make this little cap just to neaten it up and complete the look. This did mean it was time for me to actually go outside and find a tyre and to put some effort in and see what it actually swings like. I did have to do a few warm-up swings to see what it felt like. I did have concerns that the grip might be a bit too thick, but that would actually work pretty well. However, I did feel quickly how much this actually weighed. With the steel box section and the PLA, I'm pretty sure the whole thing is over 20 pounds. So I did realise this was going to take a lot more effort than I thought. Did some left-handed as well, especially as I'm doing this as a potential fitness routine. I do need to be doing it with both hands. Slight issue for me is my left wrist does have some titanium in it, and frankly it doesn't like gripping for that long. Now we are warmed up and frankly the head hasn't come off and the grip hasn't fallen to pieces, it's time to go a bit faster. I want to see how fast I can actually throw this hammer. I'm pretty sure that will be the natural limitation no matter what the training, whereas I should be able to get more reps in with training. Something I did realise with using a heavier hammer is while you do struggle to kind of get it way above your head, kind of get that full extension on it, you do find that it works your core a hell of a lot more, especially with the reps. Also, to get into a flow to do one rep, one swing after the other, there is a degree of technique manhandling to do, where you have to use more strength and more of your body weight to actually move around the hammer and get it to swing, certainly more than you have to do on a lighter hammer. And that about finishes my hammer renovation. Now, as I said earlier, I'm going to try and come back to this in the future and electroplate this hammer head.
when I eventually managed to set up for it. I'm pretty pleased with this mini project overall. It came out pretty good, and I got to learn a bit from doing those 3D printer molds and things like that. Now, I have been a little delayed on videos because I've been learning how to do the PCB software in Fusion 360 so I can do another Tech Eye, as well as finally get my own motor controller boards made for the Powered Armoured Exoscaling project, of which the next thing with that will be the arms, which should come out in the next week or so, probably next Monday, but not much later. That, of course, carrying on from the previous video. I've also got some other things in the works, so if any of that intrigues you, please feel free to like, subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video. And last of all, of course, I hope you have a great day.